Hello and welcome to another episode of the Cliff Notes podcast, where we ask a leader and find the way. Today we're joined by Rob Allen, and he's come to talk to us all about APIs and developing new applications. How are you doing today, Rob?
Hi, Tristan. I'm doing well, not too bad at all. Back in my own office again because I've been away at a client for a week, so it's really nice to be home.
That sounds good. Where have you come from today? I mean, what's your background to doing this sort of work?
Well, I'm self-employed. I run my own business. I mostly develop projects for clients. I do some consulting and some training, which is why I've been off-site. I live and work in Worcester, which is in the UK. Which is quite a nice part of the world. We call it the Midlands. So if you look at a picture of the UK, it's right at the bottom because of the way we name things around here. Been doing this stuff for a while, getting on a bit, I suppose. I've been doing development now for nearly 20 years, I think, in terms of web work. So I think I know what I'm doing, at least most of the time.
That sounds good. I know, what sort of clients or projects, what sort of size or things do you work on?
I mostly do business to business, a number of different industries, quite a lot of things in the insurance industry and the finance industries, little bit in manufacturing, fairly long-lived applications and long-lived development cycles. So my clients tend to want to write products that are going to be around for a while and then be actively maintained. Relatively low scale, low volume stuff. So I don't do applications that are going to get millions of hits per week. That's not sort of stuff I do. But all the stuff I do intentionally makes money for my clients and is there to make their lives easier.
Great. So, are these internal applications, or they're going to have customers themselves, these applications?
Yeah, mixture of the two, really. So we have a client in the US, which is a healthcare provider, and I've got some internal applications written for them to improve their processes. Insurance companies in City London, where I'm writing front-end portals that their clients use to manage the work with my client. So that sort of stuff. Very little that goes direct to public.
Okay. Yeah, and I certainly like working on processes too, and something long-lived lets you sort of see how it's working and build on it. It's a bit more of good feedback and good improvement you can make on these things.
Yes, very much so.
Cool. And so you touched on a little bit on sort of APIs and things. Is this an area that's become more popular in building applications?
Yeah, I think APIs are very much the way forward now. We keep giving them new names, and they've been around for a while. The current buzzwords are things like microservices, but the whole idea of the decoupling is so important. It's so helpful for building maintainable applications that you can't really go wrong. So nice thing about an API, of course, is I can build my business logic and my application completely separately from my presentation and my front end. Nowadays, we tend to do the front ends in more JavaScripty ways. We're using more frameworks on the client side, things like React or Angular, etc. And then they can all talk to the backend system over an API. And we've got far more flexibility. We can add the mobile app in. We can add automation in. It all just gets so much nicer to do it this way. I think APIs are definitely where the industry is moving.
That's great. And just to get on the same page for the listeners and stuff, what do you define as an API at the moment? How would someone know that was what they were looking at?
Right, so yeah, an API is an application, or I suppose we should call it an HTTP API to be slightly more specific. Sometimes we call them web services. It's an application that communicates over HTTP, and it is machine readable, is possibly the best way to put it. Another computer will be the thing that talks to your application as opposed to a user. So traditionally you have a website, the user is using the website, and then the internal JavaScript code on that website will then talk to the HTTP API to do its work.
So a little bit like a website, but it's sort of data to data communication. There's no layout, there's no design
exactly.
there.
And that's quite good for me because I'm not very good at that stuff. I've got relatively little interest in it, and other people are so much better at it than I am that I'm quite happy to leave them doing the presentation side and making it look good, making it easy to use for humans, whilst I can concentrate on writing the bit that makes it easy to develop for and easy for computers to work with.
Oh, that sounds good. At my agency, sometimes we find that building the APIs first allows us to get that business logic down before we've had to get into sort of design pieces. Do you find sort of similar that it's sort of more practical to start with that sometimes?
Yeah, very much so. And it allows you to concentrate with the client on the bit that's important, or the bit that's important to me would be better, I think. So we care at getting the business processes right. And I want my clients to concentrate on that and not be thinking about the shape of the button or the exact words that they're seeing on the screen. And that gets easier once you've decoupled the two sections of the application. So they can concentrate on the front end with their front end people, and they can concentrate on what the app does and how it is going to do it with me. And we can get that bit working correctly without the distractions.
Okay. But then the front end can then start talking to these APIs later on and get the things working for the customers.
Yeah, I mean, there tends to be a little bit of overlap. So one of the apps I wrote recently for the healthcare provider, we had the front end people had started on that maybe a couple of weeks after we started the API. So there was a little bit of lag, but we were sort of building it in tandem to a certain extent.
So you find that clients can definitely find a value in having APIs for their data and for their applications?
Generally, it depends really, because most clients are interested in the business value of the entire project. That's what they're looking for. We're here at the end of the day to either save money in business processes internally, or we're going to be making money for the client directly, and that requires the entire application. So everything needs to work in order to see the actual value. Because I tend to work on a lot of long-lived things, my clients tend to be more experienced on the idea that their application is going to last more than a couple of years. And they understand the idea of being able to maintain things separately from one another, and the real flexibility that the API gives them. They understand that idea, and they really appreciate it a couple of years later when we start making changes and we can change the API independently of the front end. And that's sort of when the light bulb moment happens. And then life gets so much easier because every other project from then on is done this way.
Sounds great. So they separate the concerns of the different parts of the application as a cost benefit too.
Yeah, cost benefits, and they also evolve at different rates. You might want to change the front end a little bit more frequently if you're doing brand refreshes or you're targeting different marketplaces and your API maybe is not changing so much. But then a little bit later, we need to change the back-end database systems, and we can do that on the API side without affecting the front end at all. So we get far more flexibility due to the fact we've separated things out. I think that's really powerful.
So therefore, is there a good way that you found to start building APIs? Good foundations?
It works the same way as any other software project, really. So I start off with pen and paper as I sort of design the general shape that we're going to be dealing with. Lots of conversations with the client as we talk about what they want it to do, how they want it to do, how they want to do it. Getting the terminology right, I mean, that's by far the most important thing that I found with pretty much any dev project. Understanding their words, making sure they understand my words, and that we agree the meaning of all the important words. That goes a long way. And then we start building in a fairly iterative process. We call it agile nowadays, but I've mostly done iterative process building for most of my career now, with lots of feedback. That makes life that much easier. Technically, it depends on the project. Some of my projects are serverless based with some JavaScript in them. Other projects are PHP based, and then I'm using some sort of framework as my foundation and building from there.
Okay. And then sort of expanding on the idea of APIs and sort of opening those up. I know that you work a lot with sort of open source platforms, things that become quite an important area of your work.
Mostly for enjoyment. I'm really one of those fortunate people where my work is my hobby, and so my hobby side comes out in the open source contributions I do. But if you look at us as an industry, there's a whole lot of sort of commodity stuff we have to do. Sending emails, connecting to APIs from the front end, routing HTTP requests. None of this sort of stuff is particularly special to my application. So I don't see why I should have to write it on my own. And that's when the open source world has really come to the fore, I think, over the last 10 years or so, where we're using open source components and then building on top of them. Standing on the shoulders of giants, as the phrase would say. And I quite like that, and I do that for all my applications. All my applications are based on open source projects, all the way from the operating system through to the programming language I use. And my way of giving back a little bit and paying forward is to contribute to open source software. Now, I don't actually contribute and write to the Linux operating system. I don't write any core PHP language code, but I can do my bit in improving the whole ecosystem, and I enjoy it. I think it's fun. So I do a number of projects. I've been heavily involved in Zend framework, PHP framework for a long while now, 10, 12 years. I'm also the lead developer of Slim Framework nowadays, which is a lovely micro framework, which works really well for APIs, and hence that's why I'm involved in it. I do some Python open source stuff with RST to PDF. I enjoy it. I think it's valuable to us as an industry, and it's possibly the only place where we can easily collaborate as different people on different teams. It's the only one that seems to work, at least.
So in your work life, you're utilizing this stuff, but in your own time, you're contributing back to this.
Yeah, very much so. And obviously, because I'm self-employed, my own time can be within work time if I choose it to be. So I have that huge benefit there, that I get to choose what I work on at any given time, as long as I actually make enough money to pay my mortgage and keep the kids fed, etc. So I get that flexibility that I can do my hobby during the day as well, which is quite nice. But yeah, I benefit from it a lot in order to make money. So I think it's quite nice to be able to work on it and help other people to make money too.
Cool. And have you found that clients already have adopted these sort of open source technologies, or sometimes you have to compare them against a more closed source paid product when you're doing an implementation?
Most of my clients don't care. Nearly all of them genuinely have no interest in the technologies I use to build their product. They just want to work in product. A few of them, it's a little bit more complicated, particularly the mainframe type customers. They have and are used to really expensive products where they have to buy expensive licensing before they can do anything. So the whole idea that they can start building a product and not have to negotiate an enterprise contract up front can feel like a breath of fresh air. But then they start worrying about, well, who's going to support it? So you have the dichotomy there where we have to talk through how the support side will work, which can be quite interesting. But it's a bit like the programming language. My clients don't particularly care which programming language I use either. They just want a product that works.
Yeah, totally makes sense. Cool. And so, I mean, is there anything you've been building on or working on recently that we may have seen or be able to then look into to taking advantage of?
In terms of open source stuff, the things I'm really interested in at the moment are obviously API based, because that's mostly what I'm doing. And PHP wise, the PHP framework, Slim framework, we've been working on fairly consistently for the last couple of years. I'm enjoying that framework. I like that it's a micro framework so that I can build on top of that with the components that I need. I like it a lot. I think it's worth investigating if you're into APIs in particular. I want something lightweight. I think it works really well. If we look forward in our industry, I think if you look at the way we develop over the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to see a lot more of what's called serverless applications. Another name for that, functions as a service. I think you've probably heard of it by now. Yeah, so Amazon Lambda is obviously the big player in the space, but there are a number of other ones out there: Google, IBM, Microsoft with Azure and stuff like that. And it's such a cost-effective way to deploy and run an application that I expect we'll be using it a lot in the future, and I'm really interested in that. I am interested in open source. I think open source is important. Being able to see the code, see how it works, multiple sets of eyes fixing the bugs, I think is all quite nice. And in the serverless space, Apache, the Apache Foundation have OpenWhisk, which is a serverless system, and that's got multiple commercial providers, which is quite nice. The big one there being IBM, but Red Hat are also doing things with it. Adobe are as well. So I'm a contributor to OpenWhisk and the open source project, and I think that's got a bright future. I think as developers we should be looking at serverless very, very carefully and adding it to our toolbox, because I suspect that we'll be using it a lot more as we go forward in time.
And I do get some people approach me with concerns for cloud security and cloud applications. Does that suggest the OpenWhisk, therefore, you could run it on your own systems or your private cloud?
Yes, you can. That's one of the exciting things about open source software, in that you can do what you want with it. So something like Amazon Lambda, you have to run it within Amazon's data centers. You have to run it with Amazon and their associated policies. And if that doesn't fit your business, then that's not going to work for you. Something like OpenWhisk, you can run it on your own infrastructure. You can put it wherever you like. You can run it in a data center yourself. You can run it on a Kubernetes cluster in some other provider. It will work directly for you. And there's a number of fairly large companies that seem to be doing that with OpenWhisk in particular, which is really quite exciting and gives you the full control. So you're still getting the utilization benefits of using a serverless platform, but you're running it within your own complete control, which particularly related to some data that you might be holding of your customers might be vitally important. So yeah, flexibility is great.
And this idea of using serverless, does that change any of the business cases or the value for using it, or it's mainly just a sort of a technology platform?
Oh, for me, it's all about the money. You can tell I've become self-employed because now I'm really into value and making sure I get my value when I buy things. And serverless is significantly cheaper than pretty much any other way to host applications on the internet. Mostly because of the cost model. You only pay when your code is running. So if your code is not running, you're not paying. And obviously this only works because they have lots of customers all using the same compute platform. And if my code is not running, someone else's code is running. So the utilization of that hardware is really high. Hence, my costs go down. If my code is not running, I'm not paying for it. That's wonderful. Most of our applications are not running 24/7. I mean, the website's available 24/7, but you don't have people on it 24/7. You're not doing lots of work 24/7. So having a platform that doesn't charge you when you're not actually doing any work is such a good value business case. It's really, really easy to sell this to a client because you're going to be saving them money.
I mean, but it fits more of the application focus rather than your company's website or the sort of product details.
Yeah, the problem becomes you have to start thinking differently, and this is one of the things we're going to learn over the next 5 to 10 years, I suspect. The biggest downside for a serverless-based application is that there is a ramp-up time for the very first request. So for your company website, you want it to respond very quickly to all your clients, and you can't have a situation where it takes a bit too long to start up. Hence, it's not ideal for that scenario. And that's why we're starting to see different types of applications, and things like React and Angular have started leading the charge for this. So excuse me. We're getting to the situation now where you'll build your application with one provider. Maybe you build it on S3. So all your HTML, your JavaScript is on S3. You'll then use a CDN, CloudFront would be the obvious one if you're in the Amazon world, to actually push your website and push the HTML code and the JavaScript, etc., as close geographically to your clients as you possibly can get it. That improves its response time. Now we've got our JavaScript website running on a CDN-based system. We can put our compute somewhere else. So we could put it into Amazon Lambda or into OpenWhisk or something like that. And we've separated out the bit the clients are seeing, again, on a very cost-effective platform. So something like CloudFront is remarkably well priced. And then we've got a well-priced compute backend in the Lambda functions. So, but it's a different way of thinking. We're no longer building websites the way we used to build them. We're having to think completely differently, which I think is also quite exciting.
And that thinking, is that just in the sort of the timing or the sort of most efficient way of operating that process?
Yeah, both really. First off, you've got to get used to the idea that your application isn't one monolithic thing. It's now split up into lots of little bits. So microservices is obviously the first place where we've started looking at this, where we have an application. The Financial Times is a fairly good example. So they've got their main website, but then all the bits that make up the website are separate services that are separate APIs that all come together to build the website. And then we go one step further. Instead of having separate APIs, we have separate functions for each bit of work, and they're all independent of one another. So we have to start thinking in a more distributed way when we design our applications, which is a paradigm shift, which will take some time for us to get used to and to think through and build the tooling for, to get our heads around how we build applications in a more cloud efficient way. Similarly, how we do our front ends is changing. We're thinking about static websites with JavaScript on them that we're building and deploying independently of our compute. It's a different way of thinking. We'll get better at it.
So it seems the process is coming a lot more like a utility, or a lot more sort of componentized and practical, that some of these pieces we don't have to think about anymore. A lot of the thinking's been done. We can just start to piece them together and make them a bit more flexible and easier to maintain.
Yeah, I think so. And obviously, the more bits that are done for us, the more someone else is amortizing that costs and the price goes down. So that's where the value starts going up for our clients, which is win-win for everyone. Mm-hmm. And no scaling. It's not our problem. We don't have to scale it. The clients, the provider scales it for us. I love that bit too.
Yeah, it certainly can be a challenge to think about for sometimes for scaling an application, and if it can already be baked into the utility you're using, then does add some reduce the stress and the cost.
Yeah, I think so. And obviously, we're starting all this out on the API side. Webhooks are one of the places where you're starting to see this first, and then we're starting to see APIs. So it's very much in my wheelhouse, which is why I'm getting quite interested in it. Very early days at the moment. I mean, Lambda came out in 2014-ish. So we're only sort of 3-4 years into this. I suspect if you look back on it in 10 years' time, we'll be using this a lot more. Great.
And just thinking of some of my manufacturing background, do you see some of this coming into more physical product use as well, or electronics or machinery, or things that are using these services? And
yes. One of the big areas where you are starting to see serverless backends turning up is with IoT devices. Things that little computing devices that are doing measurements of some form and then sending that data back to base. That works really well for a serverless collection system. So you're starting to see people who've got lots of sensors out in the world. They're not reporting all the time. They're only reporting sometimes. So they may be sending data back every 5 minutes or every 10 minutes or whatever. They hit a serverless function that will then spin up, take the data, store it into whichever persistent storage system you're using. And you're only paying when that data transfer is happening and when you need the compute to do the storage. So it works really well for certain applications like that.
Yeah, that makes sense. You've got thousands of little devices out in the field, or even just around a factory. If you don't need 1,000 open connections waiting, but if they're all checking in once a day or so, you're just going to spin that stuff up at the right time.
Yeah, exactly. And the serverless system will auto spin itself up to create enough capacity for what you need at that moment. So it works really well for that sort of thing.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, it's exciting.
That's great. Well, thanks for being able to run through those little topics today and get us a bit more flexible and open with some of our discovery and development. Have you got anything that would be good that you'd like to tell us about, or the best ways of talking to you afterwards if people are interested to find out some more?
Well, obviously I'm on the internet, as everyone is. Twitter is probably the place I'm most active in terms of social. So I'm Acrobat there, which is not spelt very obviously, Akrabat. My website's acrobat.com. That's where I tend to write about the stuff that I'm interested in. So at the moment it's quite API based and serverless based, as you can imagine. If you delve into the archives, then you get a lot more framework stuff, for instance. Yeah, I'm self-employed, so if you're interested in training around this sort of stuff, or if you need consultancy for APIs you're building, or you need some additional help for building an API, then give me a call and we can talk. That'd be cool.
Sounds good. That's great. And anything else you'd like to leave us with? Any good tips or advice or things that have been interesting you at the moment people should check out?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of APIs in particular, I've been quite interested in the way we handle errors. This is sort of one of my hobby horses. Because I also integrate with APIs, I see some really bad APIs. I don't know how people get away with what they get away with. If there's one thing you can do to make your client developers happy, write better error responses. Make it much easier for your clients to work out what they've done wrong when they're trying to integrate against your API, and they will love you forever. Little technical tip.
That's great. There's a very good book out there of how to design APIs that don't suck, which I think definitely goes into that. Writing bad APIs can definitely have people scratching their heads and having to run circles when they don't need to.
Yeah, it's so frustrating, isn't it?
No, that's great. Well, thanks very much for joining us today, Rob, and we'll look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Thanks for joining us for another episode. If you want to be able to get in contact with Rob or myself, feel free to drop us a message at holdingbay.co.uk or on Twitter. We now have a new handle for Cliff Notes Pod on Twitter. So reach out and say hello. Thank you, and we'll see you again soon.